So hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to now today discuss the duration of endocrine treatment in premenopausal women, and also whether we can escalate or de-escalate in a group of patients. I'm just going to share my screen. I'll just present uh, some of the studies pertinent to this from ASCO as well. So I think I'll just have a brief say on GnRH analogs as well during chemotherapy because they are part of the endocrine treatment. We discussed that all patients should receive 5 years of tamoxifen last time, for at least for those who are low risk. Addition of Zoladex or a GnRH agonist to tamoxifen is indicated for those at a high risk of relapse or those who remain premenopausal after chemotherapy or resume ovarian function within 2 years. And again, recommendation are based on monthly administration, but during COVID times we have learned that we have tried to individualize and made it 3 monthly in some patients as well, though this is not indicated for women less than 35. So I think I just wanted to make this point is be very careful when you start AI alone in patients with chemotherapy-induced amenorrhea. And these are two papers which have been published a few years ago, which you can see that, the ovarian function does recover during exemestane and anastrozole after 2 to 3 years of tamoxifen. So it is very, very important that you have a baseline estradiol assay and you repeat it during the anastrozole or your aromatase inhibitor treatment, especially for those patients who've had a chemo-induced amenorrhea and are not on ovarian suppression before labeling them completely postmenopausal. So doing an FSH, I tend to do a baseline FSH and estradiol about 8 months after, 6 to 8 months after they've finished their chemotherapy to get a true baseline. And I also always do a baseline in perimenopausal patients before actually they start on chemotherapy. A lot of ladies will come and say, when you're about to start chemotherapy, that their last period was 6 months ago, it is irregular, it was a year ago. So it's very, I just recently had a patient who's 55 years of age and was still having her periods. So, and I had a patient who was 40. So you have to individualize. Every patient is different. Doesn't mean that a patient is 57 that she is going to be postmenopausal. She may be peri or premenopausal as well. So be very careful when you're starting AI alone. So coming to goserelin for ovarian protection, I think this meta-analysis, basically the POEMS meta-analysis, it's important to know these studies looked at randomized trials of GnRH analogs for protection of ovarian function during chemotherapy and did show there was a 57% reduction in risk of ovarian failure. And as you can see in the goserelin group, it was 8% versus 22% in the chemotherapy group, highly significant. And pregnancy also occurred in patients who were on the goserelin arm. Also, there were some studies to show there was a negative effect, but I think this meta-analysis showed that there was an improved disease-free and overall survival. So yes, the current guidelines do recommend GnRH agonist. And what my practice is in the clinic is all women where finances or resources are not an issue. For those who are less than 40 years of age, I would consider starting them on monthly Zoladex for ovarian protection to prevent premature ovarian failure or premature ovarian insufficiency. For younger women, who've not completed their family, you would start it for preservation of ovarian of fertility preservation. So there's no long-term safety data available. And at this ASCO, I think the long-term results of the PROMISE GYM6 study were presented, where premenopausal patients were randomized, stratified by center to neoadjuvant or adjuvant chemotherapy alone versus, chemotherapy where triptorelin, which is a GnRH analog, was added as well. Small study, 133, 148 patients. And the planned endpoint was incidence of chemotherapy-induced premature ovarian insufficiency. And also they looked at the survival outcomes and also looked at the descriptive analysis in patients who had the germline BRCA variant. So as you can see, the curves are on top of each other for both disease-free survival, overall survival. This was presented at ASCO a few weeks ago, both for hormone receptor positive and hormone receptor negative. So I think this can be safely recommended as a strategy. You have randomized evidence. It's a small study, but Dr. Matteo Lambertini is doing excellent work in this field of fertility preservation and preventing ovarian insufficiency. Post-treatment pregnancies, as you can see, were more in those patients who were on the GnRH arm, 6.5% versus 3.2% in the other arm. And of the 43 patients who had the germline BRCA mutation, irrespective of treatment arm, the incidence of premature ovarian insufficiency was 20% in the goserelin arm and 20% in those who had the BRCA mutation and 12% in those without. The incidence of premature ovarian insufficiency was 0% in those who got the GnRH analog, but again, these ladies would have been very young. So these are the guidelines. These are the ESMO clinical practice guidelines for fertility preservation evaluation of gonadotoxicity risk of chemotherapy. And it's a very good paper, again, led by Matteo Lambertini. You must read this because for women who wish to preserve fertility, you need to see if you have 2 weeks or you don't have 2 weeks. So that may actually guide your strategy towards directing the fertility preservation, whether you would, and also in our population, we also have it's not legal, by the way, that in the West, if you have a partner or a boyfriend, you can go for embryo cryopreservation, but in India, it is not allowed. The ICMR does not allow that. So for you to preserve the embryo, the couple has to be married. So I found this out recently. I was quite amazed by that. So then, the ladies who are not married have the only option they have is ovarian tissue cryopreservation or oocyte or egg cryopreservation. But yes, in Indian scenario, if you're married, then the ideal would be to go for embryo cryopreservation. And yes, you must consider GnRH analogs during chemotherapy for all your ladies who wish to have a child later on. So, and if you look at, this was also presented at ASCO this year, the outcome of breast cancer patients treated with chemotherapy during pregnancy. So, in a year, all of us, some of us would see at least one patient who is diagnosed during pregnancy. And there are a lot of small cohort studies, but this was a large study. The German breast group looked into women who had chemotherapy for stage 1 to 3 breast cancer. They were less than 46 years of age at diagnosis. And what they showed was that basically it is safe to have chemotherapy. There were almost 600 ladies who were pregnant, and they compared it to those who were not pregnant. And basically this study, I won't go into the details because this is not part of the talk, but we can do this as an ASCO update later on, that they support that you can start chemotherapy for breast cancer where indicated for oncological reasons. And what we tend to do is we safely administer anthracycline and taxane-based treatment in second and third trimester of pregnancy. So coming on to the talk, we discussed that 5 years of tamoxifen does have a survival advantage, and there is a carry-on effect at 10 years and 15 years on mortality and recurrence for tamoxifen. Even 1 year of tamoxifen, as you can see from these curves, provides significant benefit. I have actually shared the slides on the chat box, but I'll put it in the group as well. And there was this small study which showed that 10 years of tamoxifen could probably provide a small benefit which would increase over time. So we're going to discuss the duration of tamoxifen today. This was the first study which was done in Scotland. and early started in 1978, about almost 1,300 patients after mastectomy, tamoxifen for 5 years versus they were given at relapse. So there was this study actually showed that there was a strong trend against more than 5 years of tamoxifen for disease-free survival and overall survival. So the whole point of presenting this study was that, to small studies which do not have a proper sample size calculation uh, uh, should not be practice changing. Nowadays, a study is presented at ASCO or ESMO, and we come back to the clinic, and before even the study is published, the drug is approved by FDA, and we start using it in the clinic. So it's very important that small studies, you have to have some confirmation from other studies as well. The NSA BP 14, B14, after 5 years tamoxifen, they were given 5 more years versus placebo, published in 2001, did show, small study again, but did show that, there was a trend for better outcome for longer duration of tamoxifen. These were the two pivotal trials which were practice changing. They were presented at ASCO 2012 and 13. Adjuvant tamoxifen to offer more, that is ATOM study, was done in UK for those who received more than 4 years of tamoxifen were randomized to discontinuing it versus continuing it for 5 additional years. Then you had the Atlas study, which was a global study, and India took part as well, and submitted and enrolled patients into this trial, both pre and postmenopausal, 10,000 women. They were after 5 years of endocrine treatment. Adjuvant tamoxifen longer against shorter. So, tamoxifen for 5 years versus tamoxifen for 10 years. Now, remember, these trials were designed in early or mid 90s. So at that time, we were still in some settings were giving tamoxifen or endocrine treatment to ER negative. So in both the studies, there is a proportion of patients where you have ER unknown status or ER is actually negative. So, but again, we know 80% of women in the West will have an ER positive breast cancer. So the assumption was that where it was ER negative, the remainder were taken as ER positive. So Atlas study basically showed that there was a significant decrease benefit in recurrence and breast cancer mortality of continuing tamoxifen beyond 5 years. There was an absolute benefit in recurrence for 4%, and there was an improvement in breast cancer mortality after the year 5 of about 3%. Both of these were highly significant. So again, there was gain was independent of age or nodes, and the risk of a pulmonary embolus was higher in the longer duration arm. There was a 0.2% mortality. I think it is very important to look at these, because I feel that when you are on a drug which is for a long time, even grade 1 and 2 toxicity is something that you must look at, because that is what is going to affect your patient's quality of life. The risk of stroke was higher, ischemic heart disease was higher in longer duration. Endometrial cancer was 1.7 times higher, when the cumulative risk was almost 3.1%, with a mortality of 0.4% for continued versus, versus 5 years, which was half, about 0.2% for 5 years, the mortality. So this is, not a small number. ATOM, the UK trial, as I said, a known ER positive, or about 40% patients, half the patients were node negative. Very similar reduction in risk of recurrence and breast cancer mortality, with an absolute reduction of about 4 and 2%. And as you can see by the treatment year and follow-up, if you look at the trend for even at 15 years, there is a carry-on effect. And we know that with tamoxifen, that even ladies who take it for 5 years, the effect is there for 10 years and 15 years. So for those who take it for 10 years, the effect is there for longer as well. to highlight the risk of endometrial cancers. But again, I must say that I don't do transvaginal ultrasounds. This trend has crept in. I see a lot of patients where they asymptomatic, they keep having 6 monthly transvaginal ultrasound and keep getting distressed by endometrial thickness of 7 millimeter, 9 millimeter, 12 millimeter. I don't think any of the guidelines recommend routine transvaginal ultrasound for patients on tamoxifen. If they have heavy bleeding or if they have menorrhagia or there is an indication to do it, then it's fine. What this does is most of these patients then end up having hysteroscopy, discontinuation of tamoxifen, starting AI, not tolerating it, going back. So it's completely a nightmare for the patient. Most of the endometrial cancers will be picked up by the patients will present with bleeding and be treated with a hysterectomy. So death from endometrial cancers was about 1% at 10 years. So pooled analysis, again, if you look at the combined analysis, there was a 15% risk reduction in breast cancer mortality, which was highly significant. And both of these trials actually led to practice change in all the guidelines where 10 years of endocrine treatment was recommended for blanketly. Though now we will discuss which patients should need it and which patients, how you tease out which patients would benefit more. So yes, there are benefits in recurrence mortality, 8%, 3%, which is not small. There's an absolute gain, of about 1 to 3%. There is a decrease in contralateral breast cancer, which is also quite significant. But one cannot ignore the risks, death without recurrence, which is up by about 1.5%, and endometrial cancers by 0.7%. And also you have these cerebrovascular events, thromboembolic events, and other cancers as well. So again, shared decision making, an honest discussion with the patient, making them aware about if they have an asymmetric swelling, if they have bleeding. It's important that your patient may not get it, but it's very important to educate the patient. That's why we have these support group meetings where we educate the patients. You may not have time in the clinic to go through everything, but it's important to educate all the patients. So coming on to the CANTO study, which was presented last year at ESMO, this is a very beautifully done French trial, basically which looked at prospectively collected detailed toxicity from patient-reported outcome measures. And it looked at the prevalence of non-adherence to adjuvant endocrine treatment in premenopausal women, and they have universal health coverage, so patients don't have to buy these drugs. And as you can see that in year 1, there was 16% non-adherence to tamoxifen. They also did serum assessments as well, and which was quite concordant. At 3 years, the number is 36% were non-adherent to tamoxifen. If you look at the AIs, the numbers are probably going to be more. So at year 3, about 1/3 of premenopausal women were poorly adherent to tamoxifen. And we discussed this last week, that it is very important to address this in your patient right on day 1. So when you look at the what is the impact of non-adherence to short-term distance disease-free survival, there's a huge impact. So there is the patients who discontinue tamoxifen, their distance disease-free survival is significantly shorter. So 3-year DDFS is about 89% versus 95%. So there is a huge difference. So I think it's very important to make sure that your patients are compliant to endocrine treatment, because a curable cancer then becomes incurable, and the patients are on treatment for life. The cost of treatment goes up. They end up being on CDK4/6 inhibitors. So again, very important. So can we safely de-escalate the duration of endocrine treatment, addition of ovarian suppression, and duration of ovarian suppression? We saw last time with the ASTRA trial, 2 years of ovarian suppression actually does lead to an overall survival benefit. It was a small study, but if you have a lady who's struggling with ovarian suppression, then at least 2 years is better than nothing. But the recommended duration in high risk patients is 5 years. So this paper was presented at ASCO this year. Can we omit endocrine treatment in some patients? An ultra low risk group, and this is a subset of the MIND-ACT trial, which is the MammaPrint 70 gene signature score. Basically, patients based on their genomic profile were classified as ultra low risk, and high risk. 36% patients were high risk, and as you can see, for ladies who were ultra low or low, the 8-year distant metastasis-free interval was 94 to 97%, which is very, very impressive. And I think it adds to us trying to de-escalate treatment now, because you've attained the cures above 95%. So what you want to do is you want to now de-escalate and identify these ultra low risk or low risk patient who could be, I would not go as to say that, could be potentially spared endocrine treatment. I would say that, you could probably not consider ovarian suppression and maybe get away with 5 years of tamoxifen. But the numbers are small, and this needs to be prospectively validated. So you must interpret this with caution. So what I use in my clinic are these two prognostic scores. Like I said, I've put it on the chat box as well, the slides. The CTS5 calculator, I'll go through it, and I'll go through the Megan risk score as well. The CTS5 score was the initial was validated in the ATAC study and then confirmed in the Big 198, and usually applies to postmenopausal. But you can actually do both. It takes less than 10 seconds to put the parameters in and get a result for your patients. Megan risk score was soft and text, so is more relevant to premenopausal patients. And again, if you do this, just put this on your window, you will get the algorithm, and you can put the grade, the age of the patient, the number of nodes. Professor Dowsett developed this, and these variables that you have easily available in the clinic. Like nodes, the size, the grade, and the age of the patient. And they were able to accurately separate patients into 3 different categories: low, intermediate, and high. And as you can see, 43% patients were low risk in the ATAC and the Big 198. And the 5 to 10 year distance recurrence risk is almost 2.5 to 3%. But if you're in the high risk, the 5 to 10 year distant recurrence risk is about 17 to 20%. So again, so if you, and what they have done is they have validated this and made an online calculation tool to identify patients who are in high risk or intermediate risk to be able to continue endocrine treatment. So like I said, I use this quite a lot, and you can see that, patients are low risk, high risk, or intermediate risk. These are some of the examples of my patients that I've used it in. Regan score, again, from soft and text trials, which we discussed last week, also classifies patients into high risk, intermediate risk, and low risk. And I'll just talk you through it. Again, this is a composite risk, very fancy statistics, which were done by Dr. Meredith Regan. And it's easily doable in the clinic. So just to show you here, do all premenopausal women need ovarian suppression? So if you have a lady who has grade 1, less than 2 centimeter, ER/PR positive, a low Ki67, again, I would not suggest doing Ki67 unless you have validated it within your lab. There is hardly any improvement, actually, of adding ovarian suppression. It's less than 1%. But if you have a lady who's PR negative, has a tumor that is more than 2 centimeters, there is almost a 10% improvement in adding ovarian suppression to an AI. Again, if you have a node positive, ER/PR positive, there would be almost a 5% improvement in adding AI plus ovarian suppression. So So I think these are certain issues that you have to individualize in the clinic. These scores and these algorithms can help you make a decision for the patient, but then ultimately, then it's your discussion with the patient that is the most important. And this is reflected on the St. Gallen scoring, which happened earlier this year. For premenopausal high-risk patients who've received 5 years of ovarian suppression plus tamoxifen. By the way, I can't think of many of my patients who've had 5 years of ovarian suppression plus tamoxifen. The question was, do you prolong treatment? And there's no evidence for this at all. But look at this, about 85% of experts around the world who make the guidelines for early breast cancer said that yes, they would either give additional 5 years of tamoxifen, and 41% said they would give actually 5 years of AI plus ovarian suppression if still premenopausal. And there is no evidence for this. So this is just expert guidance. So Regan score, again, this paper is very nicely done by Dr. Matteo Lambertini. You can, based on the Regan risk score, low risk, you can safely, or ultra low risk by any of the genomic scores, you can safely go for tamoxifen. High risk, yes, you would go for chemotherapy and followed by AI plus ovarian suppression. But when you have intermediate risk, you may end up doing any of the genomic score models, and then that will guide your treatment based on the recurrence risk, or whether they are high or low, or based on whether they have chemotherapy or don't have chemotherapy, you may give them ovarian suppression plus AI. So 2 papers at ASCO from the NSABP 42 group. Basically, this was the study which looked at, if you're going to be a breast oncologist, you must know these studies by heart. Basically, patients who'd been on an AI, this study looked at whether you extended letrozole or AI or tamoxifen, whether you took letrozole for an additional 5 years, does it add any benefit? And basically, it showed that if you had 5 years of AI, there is absolutely no benefit of giving another 5 years of AI. So there's been another study since then as well, but this study showed that did not prolong disease-free survival. So 2 scores, they looked at the BCI score, which is the 7-gene score. They looked at the MammaPrint score, which is a 70-gene score. And the 70-gene score showed that MammaPrint was not prognostic after 5 years. So they had MammaPrint low, MammaPrint high, and you can see that, there was distant relapse risk between year and 5 and 15 was pretty similar, 7% versus 28%. So MammaPrint cannot prognosticate for late recurrences, but the BCI, actually in BCI high group, they were able to show that there was benefit from extended treatment beyond 4 years. So I think, but this is data which needs to mature and be published and be also confirmed in other trials as well. So I think I have talked to you about de-escalating, which is very, very important, but one must not forget this paper and slide, that even patients who are T1, if you can see here, and node negative, if you look at the distant recurrences, even at 20 years, is quite significant, even for T1 N0 tumors. At 20 years, it's about 13%. And here, if you see, so there is risk of distant recurrence in node negative and T1 tumors in ER positive patients as well. So before we start de-escalating, I think we have to very carefully understand this and individualize this for every single patient. I've had patients who've been tolerating treatment well, and we have just continued because they've had no side effects at all. It's like taking a blood pressure pill. So this is something I'll just go through in 5 minutes. Actually, this is something which your patients are going to ask you in the clinic now, because CDK4/6 inhibitors are available in the clinic, and we are using it very routinely in advanced breast cancer. So these are the 3 trials of adjuvant CDK4/6 inhibitors plus endocrine therapy. Pallas and Penelope B are with palbociclib, and Monarch E is with abemaciclib. As you can see, the Pallas trial, very disappointing. The curves are literally on top of each other. no significant difference in either 3-year IDFS or recurrence-free survival, and same goes for Penelope B as well. Monarch E, yes, there is a benefit of endocrine treatment plus abemaciclib with almost a 3.5% absolute difference. Now, why is that? So these are all phase 3 studies. The slight differences in the trials, drug is different, the duration of treatment is different, eligibility is different. One more point I would like to make is you must start using the RCB score post neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and also CPS EG score as well. Anything that is 3 or more is taken as high risk. And I'll talk to you about this because these scores actually help prognosticate not only for clinical trials, but also in the clinic as well by telling you that this patient is probably in a high risk category. Early CDK4/6 discontinuation was there in Penelope was about 5%, almost 17% in Monarchy, and 42% in the palbociclib trial. So this is the CPS-EG score. Again, you can calculate it. Basically, it incorporates your preclinical stage. So, if you have T2N2 M0 and it becomes YP T0 N0, then the score becomes better. And post-treatment pathologic stage, as well as it incorporates the ER status and tumor grade. Now, this has been prospectively validated, and you have this this tool on the MD Anderson website, which you can use. The new bioscore, which is after the CPS-EG score, actually includes HER2 as well, and does help so with the use of adjuvant TDM1, Createx, capecitabine, all of these scores do help you in prognosticating for the patient. So coming on to these 3 trials, clinically high-risk patients, So ovarian ablation was only given to 20%, 17 to 20% patients. And as you can see, there was a 15% better disease-free survival with abemaciclib, but hardly any with palbociclib. In high-risk patients, those who had more than 4 lymph nodes involved, there was even a better benefit of the addition of abemaciclib to endocrine treatment. Now, why the differences are there? First of all, the drugs are different, and there's difference in treatment duration. There is difference in risk profile, the way they were categorized in the trials. But all 3 studies actually included high-risk patients. Penelope B was patients who had a non-PATH CR post-neoadjuvant therapy with the same drug. The duration was 1 year instead of 2 years as for PALLAS. They were all high-risk patients, but ovarian suppression was only given to 17 to 20% of patients. Anybody with more than 4 lymph nodes involved, most of these patients would be on some form of ovarian ablation for 2 to 5 years at least. And also there was a huge difference in adherence to treatment. So as always, the industry-driven studies, the Pfizer group sponsored, the next 2 papers are industry-sponsored. Basically, they will try and look at whether in a subgroup analysis of premenopausal patients, whether there is a group that they can identify who will benefit from palbociclib. So as you can see, the curves are literally with tamoxifen alone, palbociclib, tamoxifen plus GnRH, AI plus GnRH. There is no difference for addition of palbociclib. Maybe in the tamoxifen plus GnRH, the 3-year disease-free survival is in palbociclib is 83% versus 74% with the placebo. So possibly, if you see in the AI plus GnRH curves, possibly ovarian suppression with an aromatase inhibitor in high-risk premenopausal is likely going to be enough. Again, I would take this with a pinch of salt because this is a subgroup analysis which was not pre-planned. So again, they will try to look at how we can make the drug utilized by the key opinion leaders. And they did another subgroup analysis in Penelope B. They identified high-risk luminal B by HTG, this assay. And what they have shown, this does look good and promising, that patients who were luminal B, those who had palbociclib, the disease-free survival was significantly better compared to those who did not, 72% versus 45%. So I think this does look good and hypothesis generating, but not ready to be used in the clinic. Maybe we should restrict the use of CDK4/6 inhibitors in high risk luminal B tumors, but again, this needs to be prospectively validated. So I think to conclude, we need to identify in the clinic who needs more. High grade ER positive luminal B likely, who needs less. I think it's easier to de-escalate in patients who are elderly or who have multiple comorbidities or those who have low or ultra low risk. Ovarian suppression or ablation should be indicated in patients with high risk of recurrence who need chemotherapy and those who recover their periods after chemotherapy. I would reserve AI plus ovarian suppression for very high risk patients only. Very important to discuss the risk and the benefits. I sometimes put these algorithms and the calculators in front of the patient as well, because it helps both of us come to a mutual decision to proceed with the treatment. And very important to consider is extra 5 years really needed. This slide I've borrowed from my friend and colleague Shaina. Basically, it's a very good algorithm, I think, but we don't tend to do recurrence score. And this is exactly what we have discussed, that, for node negative or node micrometastasis or node positive, what would you do and what would be the duration of your endocrine treatment? Thank you. I think there are some questions on the chat box. Okay, I'll put the slides in the group. I'll put the Karishma, thank you for putting the slides. Actually, these just help you. Most of us usually have an instinct that, patient who has 4 lymph nodes involved that we would discuss. Can we use predict score? Yes, of course, you can use predict score as well. But predict score is, at the time of the patients have come to you for adjuvant decision making, not for whether you want to give a prolonged, not for the duration of endocrine treatment. That's not validated for duration. Predict is for whether the patient will benefit from chemo or not. And so that's like a prognostic a model or a predictive model. But the Regan score or the CTS5 score, which is very good for postmenopausal women, is for checking whether the longer duration of endocrine treatment will help your patient. 35-year-old T3N3, how long would one continue the GnRH analog along with TAM or exemestane? So the recommendation is 5 years. But the Astra trial, where, even 2 years of GnRH analog led to an overall survival benefit, I would at least continue for 2 years. And if she's tolerating well, I would continue for 5 years. I mean, you saw the St. Gallen. I mean, half the panelists recommended continuing it for 10 years. I mean, I was completely shocked at seeing that slide. So I decided to show it to all of you as well, because all of us who are treating, and Dr. Sareen can say that, it's very, very, very difficult to tolerate these drugs. So I would suggest minimum of 5 years. After 5 years, there is no evidence. I would just continue tamoxifen alone or the aromatase inhibitor. Anything else?
Hello, ma'am.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, ma'am, Manish here from Cancer Institute, ma'am. I have a few questions, ma'am.
Sure, go ahead.
Ma'am, in ASCO 2021, they have presented the abstract on chemotherapy in 2nd and 3rd trimester. It's an abstract form. Whether we can wait, still outcomes are not yet published.
So actually, we have. I remember in a long time ago. Actually, it's almost more than a decade ago that we looked at the Royal College of Obs and Gynae in UK with one of my mentors, Professor Ian Smith. And he had a group of about almost 40 patients who we'd given chemotherapy in 2nd and 3rd trimester. And there are some retrospective studies which have looked at live births also, and actually the cognition of the children as well. And Matteo Lambertini himself has published a paper on this. I'll put it on the group if you want. So I think it is safe to give. What we don't give are monoclonal antibodies because they increase the risk of hydramnios, and we don't give tamoxifen. But I think this will come out as a paper as well from Matthew. But he says he's already published a retrospective review showing that it is safe to give anthracycline and taxanes in second and third trimester, which we have been doing for the last almost, I would say, 2 decades.
So, ma'am, you have started giving chemotherapies to pregnant ladies in second and third trimester?
Yes, we have been doing it. In fact, I don't know if somebody's here from Tata. We've been doing it in Tata also. And I think, like I said, all of us will have one patient in a year who would be pregnant. And with locally advanced, most of these ladies, because of the swelling, young age, present as locally advanced, with large tumors. So yes, we have given it with and you would time the delivery. You would take the patient to full term. So anytime you have a lady who's pregnant, I would not discuss a termination MTP. I would try and some of these ladies, the baby may be precious, so I would encourage to continue with the pregnancy if possible.
Ma'am, one more question, ma'am. In Canto trial, you have mentioned that they are non-adherent for first year is 16%. Ma'am, what is the most common reason and how to reduce it?
So I think the most common reason is hot flushes, night sweats, and also the desire to have a family. So in premenopausal women, the desire. I mean, I've had patients where they finished chemotherapy and become pregnant 6 months later, and and this is something which you will also have, patients who want to become pregnant. We advise that they should not become pregnant for at least 2 years because the risk of recurrence is greatest in the first 2 years. But the abstract does not go into details about the reasons of non-adherence. But in our clinical practice, mostly it is hot flushes can be quite troublesome, sexual dysfunction, and the desire to have a family as well. And I think the most important thing is counseling, showing them the curves, that the outcomes are going to be significantly different. Every time you see them, one must check that they are taking the drug, because it's important that you double check. So longest you have given the GnRH analog and such. So it's one of my, I have kept on changing the hospital every 2 years, but patients I've followed up, the longest we've given is as part of the soft text was 5 years. And we recruited into those trials, so not longer than 5 years. And in Indian patients, what I tend to do is, rather than give GnRH analog, I actually try and counsel them to undergo a laparoscopic oophorectomy, because it is more cost effective, a daycare admission, especially if a lady is above 40, I would encourage them to undergo an oophorectomy, because the monthly injections are quite expensive. And plus, if you're giving them an AI, you have to keep checking their estradiol levels, making sure that, their periods do not return. So, so counsel them for a lap oophorectomy.
Ma'am, the post-chemo amenorrhea definition is clinically 1 year, usually we used to consider. But before starting AI inhibitors in perimenopausal women, which undergoing post-chemo amenorrhea or perimenopausal, we don't know. So whether we can go ahead with E2 FSH every time,
yes.
Or if 1 year is suffice.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. The trials actually, both the soft trial, I remember we did at 8 months, we did E2, and if it was less than 29 and the FSH was high, the patients were taken up taken up as postmenopausal and started on an AI. So I tend to follow exactly the same about 6 to 8 months later. Or usually, because you're seeing them every 3 months in the first year, it would usually come to 9 months that you would send their estradiol and FSH. Or if finances are an issue, then, I say that when their periods return, they must call us. And when they return, that's the time that we start them on. This is on tamoxifen. If you're planning to start on an AI, you must actually check the estradiol levels and make sure that the ladies are postmenopausal, because I showed you that, in those two studies, both anastrozole and letrozole, they stimulate the ovaries. So you will have a negative effect on the breast cancer, because the ovarian estradiol production will increase by the stimulation.
I mean, that validated score you have told, the CT-Aspire score and Reagan score, in whether it is validated in an Indian scenario, since in that one point is node 1, 2, 3 also included, where micromets we usually won't see in our cases.
So you're absolutely a very good point. We've not validated it, and that's why, we are all meeting every week or every other week, that we have to generate our own data. So at every center you're working or where you go, maintain a prospective database, and I would put the scores and then put the outcomes. You may, wherever you're working, you may have a data set which is 5 years old, 6 years old. This is such an easy thing to publish, CTS5 in postmenopausal and do the Reagan in premenopausal. It'll be a very nice paper. You can even submit it to San Antonio this year. And to see, whether it does hold true in our patients as well, especially if you have outcome data in these ladies.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, one last question, ma'am.
Yeah.
There is a, ma'am, what is the reason behind distant recurrence in PT1N0 ER positive? After 15 years, what could be the reason most common?
So I think that's the biology of ER positive breast cancer. That's why, the recurrent, I have a patient, all of us will do where, this is anecdotal, but we have quite a few patients who've recurred 25 years later, 30 years later, with metastatic cancer. And, you automatically think that you would not know whether the patient was ER positive at that time, but that the patient, when you repeat the receptor, she's ER positive. I think that's the biology of the ER positive. The triple negative and HER2 positive, you will have recurrences in the first 2-3 years. And after 5 years, literally, almost none. I have seen one triple negative patient who's recurred after 5 years, but almost none for triple negative. But for ER positive, the risk remains. But the risk is very small after 2 to 3 years. But, one must tell the patient. I feel that it's important for the patient to know that there is a small risk. And, the way I put it to patients is, there's no guarantee, even with chemo, without chemo, with hormone, without hormone. So, and you have to balance risks with benefits. If she's tolerating well, like a hypertension pill, like I said, I just continue, complete 10 years and then stop. But if they're struggling and having side effects, then, I would encourage them to stop. So after 5 years...
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. After 5 years of GnRH, if a woman is still premenopausal, can we not do oophorectomy? Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Sareen. I think that's what I start talking to them in our scenario, especially if they are above 40. That it's better to, because it's just such a pain to, and plus the assays are not good. Sometimes the report comes as less than 20, sometimes it comes as more. So interpreting the estradiol and FSH level on GnRH is also another challenge. So sometimes I ring some of my endocrinology friends when I just can't interpret the result. So I actually try and counsel them oophorectomy early on. So in a hormone positive patients, the AI or TAM is only cytostatic. Absolutely right, Dr. Sareen, and not cytotoxic. For a Gunjan, for a premenopausal woman on AI plus ovarian suppression, how frequently do you? So, for if they are, again, if they are above 45, I tend not to. Because again, the ovaries are not so robust. But for a lady, like I have a couple of 29, 30-year-olds, I would actually do it every 4 to 6 monthly. And there are a few patients where we've ended up giving 3 weekly LHRH agonists rather than 4 weekly, because the periods wouldn't stop. So I didn't do any levels. It just periods was an indication that the ovaries were quite robust. So I would at least do it 6 monthly. That's what the study also suggested, that you do it 6 monthly, especially if a lady is less than 40. Above 40, again, I would, because in above 40, I'm okay with, above 45, okay with 3 monthly LHRH. That's what we've done during COVID times as well. And I don't think we've compromised the care. So again, what's your experience of ovarian ablation by radiation? That's a very good question, Dr. Rashmi. The thing is, at the last ESMO meeting in Lugano, that was 2 years ago, and we discussed this at length, and everybody agreed this was just a meeting for young women with breast cancer, that this is something we should not recommend. And but I know that in Indian scenario, including a lot of centers around the country, radiotherapy to the ovaries is practiced quite frequently. And this is a very India-specific thing, I feel. And I totally understand with resource limitations, it is not not negative. I mean, it's something which we should explore, but we should publish about it. And there's hardly any data about the ovarian function measurement on post-radiation. My experience has not been good with the patients whose ovaries has been radiated. I would rather go for an oophorectomy or go for GnRH. The biggest downside with GnRH that these drugs are quite expensive. So even to prevent premature ovarian failure for the patients, I hesitate. So is there a role for GnRH analog and premenopausal first-line metastatic? Yes, absolutely. So, the patients who are have advanced breast cancer and are premenopausal, I would start them on tamoxifen plus GnRH analog, and down the line switch them to a CDK4/6 inhibitor and an AI. The reason we want to give an AI, I know there is data on with ribociclib, with the tamoxifen, is all the patient support programs that we have in India for CDK4/6 inhibitors, where they buy it for 8 months. Per month is almost 70 to 80,000 rupees. If they buy it for 8 months, then it's available to them free for life. And the support program only holds true if you're giving it with an AI. So if my prescription says, I've written palbociclib plus tamoxifen, that will not count for the support program. So I would, as soon as possible, want to stop the tamoxifen and switch them to NAI. And so that's why, giving GnRH analog. And again, here I would counsel patients to undergo a laparoscopic oophorectomy sooner rather than later.
Bhavna, have you seen, I see patients with GnRH analogs and tamoxifen, and of course 40, 42 and above, we continue to do the ovarian hormones, and they all are so topsy-turvy. They do not conform to a defined defined hormone values to say that they are postmenopausal or not. I do not know if the GnRH play a part in the ovarian hormones. Functions are so topsy-turvy. They don't conform to either postmenopausal or premenopausal. The E2 is high, the FSH is low. I do not know. I mean, I always end up being very confused.
I agree with you, Dr.
My patients undergo an oophorectomy.
I try and counsel for oophorectomy because sometimes, like I said, even I have problems interpreting. So then what happens is ultimately then I call them again in 4 weeks time, 6 weeks time, and repeat it again.
The rise.
Yeah, rise going down. But again, it's not, I think it's not good for patients' quality of life.
Right.
But so I think best is for, if to counsel them for an oophorectomy. And nowadays with laparoscopic, they just get admitted in the morning, go home in the evening. The packages are good. So it turns out to be more cost effective for them as well.
And if they are made postmenopausal by the GnRH and tamoxifen, so hopefully they should not have many side effects
Yes.
And if they have it with an AI, you can always switch back to tamoxifen.
Absolutely. So that's why you gradually phase the AI in, because
Yeah,
otherwise the
yeah.
toxicity can be quite
Right,
quite
right.
significant. Yes, absolutely.
Ma'am, good evening. So,
Hi, good.
ma'am, can I ask one question?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So if one patient is already now post-menopausal, she has received chemotherapy. She is a young patient, 40-year-old lady. She has received chemotherapy, and because of chemotherapy effect, now her E2 FSH LH levels, they are post-menopausal, and we have started her on aromatase inhibitor with ovarian function suppression 3 monthly. But what is the frequency to monitor? Means it could be a temporary. I know there are no guidelines, but what actually you follow means, do you entirely rely on only one report, or you keep on monitoring every 6 monthly or yearly? This is I wanted to know.
So if the lady is less than 40, I would actually give monthly LHRH analog, because ovarian function can return, and prefer to give monthly if they are less than 40. And like Dr. Sareen said, it's this can be, if the patient is not having periods, you could just not monitor, because on actually Zoladex, the LH and the estradiol does do quite a lot of up and down. So that's why having serial measurements and a baseline is very important, pre-chemo and post-chemo, and then when you start it. So I tend to do it every 6 months in patients, but I have a very high index for oophorectomy. The counseling starts right at the beginning, after they've had their first cycle of chemo, and they usually come around by the time they're ready to start treatment.
And one more question, ma'am. Do you have any personal experience with irradiating the ovary? Because sometimes we land up in a situation that patient is very apprehensive for surgery and not willing for monthly or 3 monthly injection. So means I have not given anyone, but I just wanted to know: have you ever had any experience with?
Yeah, I have actually in some of the centers I've worked in India, and experience has not been good. We've had a patient where it radiated and the periods have come back, and another patient where I did the estradiol levels, and before starting an AI, the levels were not. But there have been patients who have done very well and they have remained postmenopausal. But I think the consensus was, but I feel the consensus also could be related to the ignorance of the panelists in the West. So, when we started talking about doing SBRT to the portal vein, everybody laughed it off in the West. And now everybody is talking about it. We started doing it. So again, this is something we need to generate our own data and show that, that yes, it's robust, and this is what you need to do.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Great. So you put it on the group. What do you want next week? And we'll have another session on GI or breast. And if you whether you want an ASCO update on breast cancer, if you want, I'm doing that anyway, so we can talk about ASCO update next week. I've tried to include all the endocrine stuff today, but we can talk about that. But let me know on the group, and then I'll schedule a chat. Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.